She vanished 10 years ago, erased from every record, but now Captain Maren Holt is back. A legendary soldier from a secret unit thought dead. She walks into a base that doesn't know what's coming and shakes the foundations of an entire military. When rogue operatives strike, Emberfall awakens, and the ghosts of the past fight like they never left. I hadn't put on a uniform in nearly 10 years. Not since the day I walked away from active duty with nothing but a duffel bag and silence in my throat. The fabric had dulled to a smoky gray, threads frayed around the sleeves, insignia faded into memory. Still, I pulled it from the cedar chest that morning without hesitation. Not for glory, not for nostalgia, but because something I couldn't name insisted I wear it. By noon I was driving toward Fort Garrison, a Midwestern base outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. Officially, I was listed as a consulting logistics advisor, invited to observe a multi-division conference on operational doctrine. Unofficially, I was something else entirely. Something most of the room had no idea existed. At 44, I didn't look the part anymore. The shine was gone. The military these days liked its officers polished, tech-savvy, and camera-ready. I was weathered, my eyes sharper than my uniform. My name is Captain Maren Holt, formerly of Task Unit Emberfall, a unit that was never supposed to exist. After Operation Iron Veil, we scattered, vanishing into quiet civilian lives. That was the deal. No records, no reunions, no explanations. We carried silence like a second spine. When I stepped into the officers' dining hall at sunrise, conversation cut like a wire. Forks hovered, eyes flicked. Then the first whispers came. Somebody forget to tell Grandma, it's not Halloween. Check out the boots, straight out of a museum. I ignored them. Took my seat in the far back. Black coffee. Notebook open. The same notebook I had carried since my first deployment. Pages filled with diagrams, scrawled field notes, and, in later years, names. Not out of bitterness, but because I'd learned something simple. What people reveal when they think you don't matter is the truest record of who they are. A sergeant, barely older than I had been on my first tour, swaggered over with a smirk. "Ma'am, you sure you're in the right room?" I looked up, smiled softly. Pretty sure. He didn't expect me to answer. That was enough to send him back to his table, shaking his head. They didn't notice the small, near-invisible emblem on my shoulder. A black triangle, its silver outline dulled with age. To most, it was a forgotten patch. To those who knew, it was something else entirely. A symbol never spoken aloud. That night at the pre-conference mixer, the young officers got louder. Arrogance filled the air like cheap perfume. One captain, ribbons gleaming but hands soft, stopped near me with a grin. "Maybe you'll learn something tonight, ma'am. We operate differently now. Your generation made the mistakes. We build on them." The table laughed. I didn't flinch. Didn't say a word. Silence was my answer. Not indifference, endurance. They didn't understand that silence is not weakness. It's waiting. And I was waiting, because I knew the moment was coming. The next morning, the conference hall buzzed with polished brass and practiced smiles. At the podium stood Colonel Avery Locke, young, sharp-jawed, never tested outside simulation drills. He spoke like a man pitching investors, not briefing soldiers. "We honor our past," he said, "but we don't let it dictate the future. Old methods are outdated. History serves as little more than cautionary tales." His gaze swept the room until it landed on me. His lips curled. And yet, some seemed to think presence equals relevance. Dozens of eyes turned. I didn't move. "What matters today is innovation, not reputation," Locke continued. "Sometimes the best thing the older generation can do," his pause was deliberate, "is step aside." I stood slowly. No drama, just presence. My voice carried steady across the hall. "Sometimes, Colonel, the best thing the younger generation can do is realize they don't know what they don't know." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. 10 minutes later, the doors opened. General Elias Ward, commander of Fort Garrison, stepped in. His face was carved from years of scars and survival. He scanned the crowd, and then he saw me. His eyes dropped to the black triangle on my sleeve, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He spoke low, but the room heard it. "Captain Holt, I need a word. Now." Whispers cut off mid-breath. Chairs scraped. Every gaze followed me as I walked forward. I didn't need their respect. What came next wasn't for me. It was for them. The briefing room door locked behind us with the sharp hiss of magnetic seals, the kind reserved for classified discussions. I stood still, hands at my sides, the old uniform whispering with every shift of fabric. General Elias Ward paced the perimeter like a soldier, checking a perimeter only he could see. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. I knew that look, trying to reconcile memory with the body standing in front of him. Finally, he stopped. His voice was rough, like gravel dragged over steel. Maren Holt, he said, the name leaving his mouth as though he hadn't spoken it in years. I nodded. Emberfall, I replied. Ward leaned forward, palms flat on the cold metal table. His eyes locked on mine. You shouldn't exist. That makes two of us, I said evenly. He exhaled hard through his nose. Not a laugh. Something heavier. Then he keyed into a terminal bolted to the wall, punching in a sequence I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. The screen lit with a file stamped. Class 7. Emberfall/Echo Vale. My photo appeared. Younger. Blood-streaked. Caught in the background of a grainy satellite still taken moments before our exfil helicopter arrived. You led the southern flank during Iron Vale, Ward muttered, more to himself than to me. Intercepted a rogue supply network. Took down a warlord who officially didn't exist. I gave a small nod. He scrolled further. Most entries were blacked out, thick blocks of redaction like blackout poetry. Then, nothing. No reassignment. No discharge. Just one word. Decommissioned. You were buried with the operation, he said flatly. It was the deal, I answered. 3 of us walked out. We agreed, disappear. Live quiet. Never speak of it again. And yet here you are. His eyes flicked to the black triangle stitched to my shoulder. I was never hiding, General. Just serving differently. Ward's jaw tightened. Do you realize that Emblem still triggers silent alerts? Last time it surfaced, Joint Command scrambled an intel review in under 10 minutes. I'm aware, I said. Then why wear it now? Because your base, I said, leaning forward, has forgotten how to listen. That made him pause. I slid my old notebook across the table. Its pages were filled with names, half-legible scribbles, fragments of overheard arrogance. Not to shame, to remember. They think experience is a relic, I said quietly. They mistake silence for absence. Ward sat slowly, his posture no longer combative but calculating. His scarred hand tapped the table. And what do you want, Captain? Nothing for me, I replied. But your officers need to learn what it costs when arrogance outruns wisdom. I don't want a stage. I don't need a spotlight. Give me a position. I'll teach quietly. Ward rubbed his temples, staring at the file still glowing behind him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, I could place you as senior tactical advisor, under sealed non-disclosure. Your service remains buried, but your authority would stand. I gave the smallest nod. And Locke? He asked, meaning Colonel Avery Locke, the young officer who had turned me into his cautionary tale. Let him teach what he knows, I said. I'll fill in the rest. Ward's lips twitched, not a smile, more like a grim acknowledgement. This base doesn't deserve you. No, I agreed. But it needs me. He rose, extending his hand. His class ring clicked against my scarred knuckles as we shook. Then welcome back, Captain Holt. When we stepped back into the corridor, silence fell like a curtain. Conversations cut mid-sentence. Officers stared. Ward said nothing, but he walked beside me, step for step, toward the conference room. At the door, he paused. You ready for this? I met his eyes. I've been ready since before they were born. The conference hall went still as General Ward stepped up beside Colonel Locke. The projection screen behind them still displayed a frozen slide. Operational innovation, breaking from the past. Ward didn't even glance at it. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his voice carrying across the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce your new senior tactical advisor for special operations training, Captain Maren Holt. The words moved like a shockwave. A ripple of half-gasp, half-silence swept across the crowd. Some officers tried to mask their surprise with tight jaws and straight spines. Others didn't bother. They gaped. I caught the twitch in Colonel Locke's eye. First confusion, then defensiveness, and finally something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. She will be revising our field training curriculum effective immediately, Ward continued. and I expect every one of you to treat her with the same respect you would give any superior officer in this chain of command." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink. Then his tone hardened. "Because if you don't, you'll answer to me." The silence was total. Locke's face flushed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he tried again. "General, with all due respect, what qualifies her for this?" Ward tilted his head slightly. "Are you really asking me that?" Locke stiffened, clearly aware he was already on the edge of insubordination. "We have no record of her recent deployments. Her file is lacking in detail." I stepped forward before Ward could speak. My voice was calm, but cut the air clean. "You're right, Colonel. My file is incomplete." He turned toward me, trying to recover. "Then how are we supposed to assess?" "You're not," I interrupted. "You're here to learn from me." The ripple that moved through the room this time wasn't laughter. It was something heavier, something close to realization. Ward narrowed his eyes. "Colonel, I suggest you sit and listen." Locke sat. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor echoed like a reprimand. I walked to the edge of the podium, not to command it, but to face the rows of polished uniforms. "You think experience looks like a sharp crease in your trousers and a well-curated resume," I said quietly. "But out there, in the dirt, in the dark, experience doesn't wear a name tag. It doesn't advertise." I held up my notebook. Its bent spine and weathered pages seemed fragile, but it was heavier than any manual they had ever studied. "This," I said, "is your warning. I've been writing down every time one of you dismissed wisdom for arrogance. Not to punish, to teach. And the lesson starts now." I snapped the notebook shut. The sound cracked like a gavel. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't want applause. I stepped down from the podium and took my seat. And for the first time since I walked into that base, the silence wasn't ridicule. It was recalibration. When the session ended, no one whispered behind my back. They whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what they had seen, who I was, what they had missed. Colonel Locke didn't meet my eyes when he left. He looked at the floor. 3 days later, Fort Garrison already felt different. You wouldn't think a base could change that quickly, but culture doesn't shift gradually. It breaks all at once. One spark, and the system scrambles to realign itself. Officers who once smirked now nodded tightly when we crossed paths. Others found reasons to stop by my office, framing their questions as logistical clarifications, but staying longer than necessary. What they really wanted wasn't credentials. It wasn't medals. They wanted to understand how silence had turned into strength. The training hall smelled faintly of metal polish and damp canvas. Rows of young officers sat stiff-backed, eyes forward but restless. They expected another slideshow on doctrine, another hollow pep talk. What they got instead was me. I stood at the front with no projector, no scripted bullet points. Just my notebook. "How many of you," I began, voice steady, "have gotten someone hurt because you followed the book instead of your gut?" Blank stares. Silence. Then, slowly, one hand went up. Then another. Then 3. That was enough. "This isn't about making you heroes," I said. "It's about making sure you don't get your team killed because you were too proud to admit what you didn't know." I saw the shift then, the slight lean forward, the pencils pausing mid-spin. They weren't listening out of obligation anymore. They were listening because something inside them recognized the cost of arrogance. I didn't tell war stories. I didn't list classified ops or flex scars like credentials. I gave them mistakes. Mine. Others. Failures that didn't make it into official reports. Leadership isn't being the loudest voice in the room, I told them. It's knowing when silence will save lives. The younger officers looked uneasy, as if they were being asked to unlearn something they'd been polishing since their first day in uniform. That unease was the point. Colonel Locke didn't show up for the first 2 days of sessions. Rumor had it he'd been reassigned temporarily to desk work pending a leadership review. Official channels said nothing. Unofficial ones said everything. By the 3rd day, I found a folded note on my desk. The handwriting was tight, almost nervous. "Captain Holt, I would like to speak with you privately. I was wrong. Locke." I left it unopened for most of the day. That night, I found him waiting outside the training field. His jacket was zipped to his chin, hands shoved deep into his pockets like a cadet reporting for punishment. "Colonel," I greeted, my voice flat. He straightened. "I owe you an apology." "You owe it to yourself," I said. "But I'll hear it." His eyes dropped. I thought I knew what leadership looked like. I thought modern meant better. I waited. I forgot that humility is part of command, he admitted. I forgot that the quiet ones might be carrying the loudest lessons. I studied him. For the first time, the polish was gone. He wasn't speaking for show. You don't need to explain your arrogance, I said finally. You need to replace it. He nodded once. I'm ready to learn. That was enough. We walked the perimeter in silence, side by side, no rank between us. Just recognition. The wind off the Wyoming plains cut cold across the training field. I tugged my sleeve, adjusting the edge of the black triangle patch. You ever wonder what it costs to carry a secret so heavy it bends your spine? I asked quietly. Locke swallowed. I do now. I didn't smile, but I didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. The office lights were off, the only glow coming from the moon bleeding through my blinds. I sat with my old notebook open, but my eyes weren't on the pages. They were on a single name I hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 10 years. Reyes. The syllables tasted metallic. He had been our intel officer, the one who always found back doors in places where none were supposed to exist. After Iron Veil, he vanished into quiet anonymity. Last I heard, he'd become a librarian in Nevada, changed his name, buried his history like the rest of us. And Conrad, our comms specialist. She'd been sharper with a rifle than most ground teams I knew. Rumor said she worked as a fire lookout near Glacier National Park. A tower, a radio, and long silences between transmissions. The three of us had walked out of that desert alive. We promised to disappear. We promised to bury Emberfall with silence. But silence, I'd learned, grows heavy. A month into my new role at Fort Garrison, the pull became unbearable. That night, I walked into the comms room after hours. The place smelled like dust and old circuitry. I switched to a frequency no one had touched in years. One I'd memorized, but never dared to dial. The radio crackled. My hands were steady, but my chest wasn't. This is Holt. Emberfall 07. Wellness check. Confirm alive. Silence. The static dragged like a blade. Then, faint, almost broken. 09. Tower secure. Fireline clear. Conrad. My throat caught. Another pause. Then, quieter still. 03. Library's closed, but I'm still standing. Reyes. I sat down hard. 10 years of silence fractured in a heartbeat. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Just one thing. I reached for my sleeve and ripped the patch free from the inside lining. For years I'd kept the black triangle hidden beneath the fabric. This time, I sewed it on the outside. The silence on the other end of the line wasn't fear. It was understanding. They didn't ask why. They already knew. For a moment, just a breath, we were a unit again. I turned the radio off. Didn't cry. Didn't smile. Just whispered to the dark. Still serving. Because some missions don't end. Some just go quiet. The call came at 0432. An emergency alert cracked through my comms. Intermittent. Garbled. A training unit had gone silent in the Granite Sector, 20 miles west of the base. Mountain terrain. Dense cover. Zero visibility without infrared. I was dressed before the echo faded. By 0445, I was in the tactical center, where young officers usually so loud now stood pale and rattled. Colonel Whitman briefed me fast. Unit Delta 7. 10 cadets. 1 junior commander. Last check-in at 0200. Then nothing. Their coordinates. He gestured at the wall screen. Here. But the storm rolled in. GPS lost. Radios jammed. Jammed, I repeated. Whitman shifted uncomfortably. Could be weather interference. I shook my head. No, that's contact. You mean, he swallowed, intentional. And trained. His face drained of color. But this is a training zone. No one's supposed to be. Doesn't matter. You don't wait for confirmation in this scenario. You move. I pulled on my field coat and reached for my go bag, still packed from deployments no one admitted I'd ever taken. Captain Holt, Whitman called after me. You're not cleared. I'm already 10 years overdue for clearance, sir. Then I was gone, into the storm. The Granite Sector greeted me with silence. Not the natural kind, not the quiet of wind and trees. This was manufactured silence, the kind that follows jamming frequencies and careful planning. I drove until the gravel road thinned into mud, then left the vehicle behind and moved on foot. The fog pressed down like a second skin. Visibility collapsed to 30 feet. Every step crackled damp earth under my boots. Instinct took over. My compass wasn't in the needle, It was in the patterns. I followed the slope of the terrain, the bent angle of broken branches, the faint heat still clinging to a dropped flare casing I found a mile in. Then I heard them. Muffled voices. The sharp edge of panic hidden under forced whispers. I crept forward, belly low against the rocks until I saw them. The cadets of Delta 7, huddled behind an overturned supply crate. 10 of them. Young faces painted with fear. Their squad leader, Lieutenant Bray, was bleeding from a gash across his forehead. Their comms unit was nothing but sparking metal and shattered plastic. 2 figures moved through the fog ahead. Dark camo. Silent. Too clean. Too fluid. Their gear wasn't standard issue. They weren't friendlies. Not a drill. I slid behind cover and pulled out a signal mirror, angling it low. 2 quick flashes, then pause. Ashfall code 4. Observe. Do not return fire. Bray caught it. His eyes widened but sharpened just as quickly. He tapped 2 cadets on the shoulders, gave a silent count, and steadied them. Good. He understood. I shifted around the flank, moving like I had a decade earlier. Low, tight, controlled. The mercenaries were pulling back slow, careful, as though they hadn't expected resistance. They didn't see me until it was too late. 3 minutes. That's all it took. 1 down. Another down. The 3rd ran. I let him. You always leave one to leave a trail. When I circled back, the cadets were staring at me like I was a ghost. You're Holt. One whispered, voice breaking on the name like it was a story they weren't sure was true. I nodded. You're all alive. That's what matters. I patched Bray's head wound, checked over their injuries, then activated my emergency transmitter. A coded pulse, short and tight. 40 minutes later, rescue teams cut through the fog. But the real shift had already happened. Respect didn't come from medals or polished titles that day. It came in the way those cadets moved when I told them to. It came in the way they trusted my voice through the dark without question. It came in their silence. The right kind of silence. The debrief ran 6 hours. I sat across from a panel of officers, intelligence liaisons flown in from Peterson Command, and General Ward at my side. The attackers were confirmed, rogue ex-military contractors. Equipped, trained, and deliberate. They had been probing, testing our response window. Why target a training unit? One of the intel officers asked. They weren't after cadets, I answered. They were after timing. And someone fed them the schedule. A mole. The word hung in the room, unspoken but understood. General Ward leaned forward, his scarred hands folded. She didn't just prevent casualties, he said, his voice like gravel grinding steel. She redefined the protocol under fire. Those cadets saw what it means to adapt in chaos. Something you cannot teach in a classroom. They offered me a medal. I declined. I didn't do it for that, I said. I did it so they'd come home. But inside, I knew it wasn't over. The cadets had been a probe. The real strike hadn't yet come. The folder was waiting for me when I returned to my office. No name, no stamp, just a single paperclip holding the contents together. I shut the door before I opened it. 4 photographs slid out. The first 3 were of me, entering the base, briefing cadets, exiting the training field. Surveillance, close enough to be deliberate, distant enough to be cautious. The 4th wasn't me. It was Conrad, crouched beside a fire tower in Montana, taken from a ridge line through a long lens. My hands went cold. This wasn't coincidence. Someone knew, not just about Fort Garrison, about Emberfall. They weren't after the base. They were after us, the ghosts who were never supposed to exist. That night, I returned to the comms room. The lights hummed low, and the radio felt heavier than it should. I tuned to the old frequency. This is Holt. Emberfall 07. Code black. Confirm status. Seconds stretched. Then Conrad's voice, steady as the tower she manned. 09. Tower secure. Message received. A pause, then Reyes. His voice thinner, like it had been carried a long distance through smoke. 03. Eyes open. They're hunting. I exhaled slowly. We were all awake now. The following days blurred into a quiet storm. I rewrote Fort Garrison's emergency response grid from the inside. On paper, it looked like a routine systems upgrade. In reality, I was building an exit strategy. Not for me, for the cadets. Because I knew the strike would come. And when it did, they'd aim at the weak links first. General Ward didn't argue when I pulled him in. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "How can I help?" "Act normal," I told him. Don't give them noise too early. Ghosts disappear when the shadows move. Intel confirmed the worst a week later. There wasn't one mole. There were three. One in logistics, leaking training cycles. One in communications, backdooring secure lines. And one, God help us, in training ops. Breadcrumbs had been laid for months. The Granite Sector ambush was never about cadets. It was bait. They wanted Emberfall. Not for intel. For leverage. I stared at the folder again. The photographs of Conrad. Of Reyes. Of me. They'd tagged us as assets. But they didn't understand. We weren't assets. We were liabilities to anyone who underestimated us. I made 2 calls that night. First to Conrad. You still got backup gear cached? Always, she replied. Her voice carried no fear. Just readiness. Then to Reyes. Libraries are getting loud, he said before I could speak. Someone's been combing systems. Time to close up shop. We chose a meet point. Neutral ground. An old safe house buried in the Wyoming foothills. Coordinates burned into memory a decade ago. Then I erased every trace of our call. We weren't going to be ghosts caught in the dark. We were going to be ghosts moving through it. The safe house was exactly as we had left it 10 years earlier. Hidden beneath a collapsed ranger station near the Wyoming border, tucked behind a wall of shale only someone with the right eyes would think to move. The air smelled of dust, old gun oil, and silence. I arrived just before nightfall. Conrad was already there, crouched beside the comms box, her sidearm holstered but her eyes sharp. Thought you'd never call, she said without looking up. I hoped I wouldn't have to. She gave the faintest smirk. Hoped isn't much of a plan. 2 hours later, the hatch opened again. Reyes climbed down the rusted ladder, breathless but steady, lugging a duffel bag stuffed with encrypted drives and stacks of notes. No one followed me, he said, shutting the hatch with a metallic thud. But someone sure tried. We didn't waste time. The table was soon covered with maps, timestamps, printouts, surveillance patterns. The mercenary ambush at Granite was only a fragment. Cross-referenced with other data, a wider design began to emerge. It wasn't just Emberfall. Across the country, similar units were being tracked. Ghost divisions, off-record operators, anyone whose existence was a shadow in official history. They were being erased. Not just killed, deleted, as if they had never existed. Reyes tapped a page with the butt of his pen. This isn't cleanup. This is a purge. They're removing proof. Of what? Conrad asked. Of every time the official story didn't match reality, he replied grimly. I leaned back against the cold wall, the weight settling. They're not hunting people. They're hunting history. Silence followed. Heavy. Familiar. We had a choice. Run, or remind the world why Emberfall had been created in the first place. Reyes looked up. We still have friends. Quiet ones. Buried deep. Conrad nodded. Light the fire now, or there won't be anyone left to see it burn. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the patch. The black triangle with its faint silver edges. I laid it in the middle of the table. Conrad stared at it, then reached into her pack. She pulled out her own patch. Worn, frayed, but real. She placed it beside mine. Reyes followed, laying his next to ours. 3 patches. 3 ghosts who weren't supposed to exist anymore. I picked up the old field phone. The one we'd sworn never to touch again after Iron Veil. The line that could wake shadows we had all buried. This is Holt, I said into the receiver. My voice didn't waver. Emberfall 07. One call to bring it all to light. The fallout would come. Quiet, strategic, devastating. But in that moment, with the patches spread on the table between us, I felt something I hadn't in years. We weren't ghosts anymore. We were a unit. Again. The morning after our reunion, the Wyoming foothills were quiet, but the kind of quiet that presses against the skin, waiting for a crack to exploit. I didn't sleep. The maps, coordinates, and surveillance prints sprawled across the table had kept my eyes open, tracking patterns like old constellations I had once memorized. Each line, each timestamp, suggested a network larger than any single mercenary cell. Someone was orchestrating a sweep, a purge of off-record operators across multiple states. Emberfall was just the first domino. Conrad had vanished before sunrise, leaving only a half-empty thermos of coffee and the faint scent of pine resin. Reyes was sprawled across the floor, his laptop glowing in the dim light, fingers dancing across the keys. His quiet hum punctuated the stillness, like a metronome counting down to the next step. Signal's clean, he said without looking up. But traffic's heavy. They're scanning old comm nodes, running cross-checks against personnel logs, Black Ops contracts, even civilian ID tie-ins. Whoever this is, they've built a matrix to trace us in real time. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening to him. 10 years of experience had trained me to move in silence. But the danger of exposure sharpened the edge of my instincts. They're not just hunting Emberfall, I said slowly. They're hunting anomalies. People who officially don't exist. That means anyone who's ever worked off the books, anyone who survived without leaving a paper trail, they're targets. Reyes stopped typing. His head tilted toward me, eyes dark with thought. And if they're this organized, this patient, they probably have resources we haven't even detected. Satellites, drones, private contractors. They're not improvising. They're executing a calculated elimination protocol. I rubbed the edge of the black triangle I kept pinned to my coat. Its silver outline caught the morning light through the cracked windows. Then we play the same game, I said. Calculated. Silent. Lethal if necessary. He nodded. We need intel, safe houses, extraction points. Every contingency Emberfall ever used. We map it. We rehearse it. We bury it deeper than they can reach. By midday, we were already moving. Conrad returned, her presence like a phantom stepping from the shadows. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer warnings. She simply laid down a stack of encrypted drives and began unpacking field gear as if she'd never left the tower in Montana. I watched her, noting the precision of her movements. You've kept sharp, I said. She didn't smile. Had to. One wrong move, one trace left behind, and it's over. We're ghosts only if no one sees us until we choose to be seen. Reyes flipped through the maps. Our first priority is containment. If they're sweeping up, we need to funnel them into predictable channels, mislead them. If they think they're chasing Emberfall, they're chasing shadows. I drew a line across the map, circling towns, ridges, and old ranger stations. We lure them. Make them think we're fragmented, scared. They'll expose their hand, and when they do, we'll have the advantage. The plan was simple on paper, but deadly in execution. It required discipline, patience, and absolute silence. No radio chatter unless encrypted, no digital trail, no deviation. Every step we took would be mirrored, analyzed, and exploited if we weren't meticulous. Hours passed in methodical preparation. Each of us moved through the familiar motions of a life once lived, checking weapons, recalibrating scopes, rehearsing extraction signals. My notebook lay open, pages filled with names, coordinates, potential contact points. Not just ours. Any ally Emberfall had tucked away, anyone willing to stand in the shadows with us. Night fell like a velvet curtain. The foothills were alive with the rustle of wind through shale and pine. I felt it in my bones. The anticipation of the hunt, the silent promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. I glanced at the patches on the table, 3 black triangles side by side, frayed edges catching the dim light. They weren't just symbols of the past. They were contracts, reminders that the unit that had been buried in silence was now awake, moving as one. Reyes looked up from the laptop. We should set watches. They'll move at first light, and we can't afford to be blindsided. Conrad stood by the hatch, weapon loose but ready. Then we take first shift. Quiet, all 3 of us. Eyes open. I nodded, the weight settling in my shoulders. This was no longer about teaching or training. This was survival, precision, and proving that ghosts, once awakened, could strike louder than any record or report could measure. And for the first time in a decade, Emberfall was alive again. The first light of dawn filtered weakly through the fractured clouds. The foothills were gray and silent, but I knew better. Silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before calculation, the space between predators and prey. I moved along the ridge with Conrad and Reyes, each step deliberate, every breath measured. The wind carried distant echoes, birds, maybe, or something less innocent. Reyes checked the comms box one last time. Frequency sweep shows activity near the granite sector, but it's scattered. They're probing, testing, not committing. His voice was quiet, taut with the awareness that any sound could be fatal. I crouched behind a boulder, adjusting the scope on my rifle. The lens reflected the terrain like a map of shadows. They want Emberfall, I murmured. Every step we take, every move, they're predicting it. They think they understand ghosts. Conrad's hand hovered near her holster. They'll learn the hard way they don't. We split into staggered positions, keeping lines of sight across the valleys and ridges. The first target appeared 10 minutes later, a single figure in black tactical gear, moving slowly, methodically. Not a patrol. A scout. I signaled Reyes. He mirrored my movement, positioning to cut off potential escape. I watched the figure through the scope. The training had ingrained patience into my bones. The kill zone wasn't just where we could strike, it was where they exposed themselves. The scout paused, crouched, and keyed a device. A jammer. Bingo. I tapped Reyes' shoulder. Silent acknowledgement. Conrad shifted left, shadowing the flank. We moved like phantoms through fog and shale. When the scout's hand lifted again, Reyes struck first. Non-lethal takedown, precise, efficient. The figure slumped, unconscious. The jammer was disabled. Another victory unseen, unrecorded, but critical. The next hour was a blur of movement. 3 more figures, each neutralized with precision, each leaving a breadcrumb trail that misled the rest of the cell. They were skilled, but not Emberfall skilled. They underestimated the ghosts who had been erased from history. By noon, the fog had lifted, revealing the wider terrain. Satellite drones buzzed high above, unauthorized but untraceable. I realized then that the network behind this purge was even more sophisticated than our initial assessment. Someone powerful, someone patient, was orchestrating these sweeps. We pulled back to the safe house, bodies tense but alert. Conrad tended to minor scratches. Reyes cataloged intel from the scouts. I stood at the window, scanning the ridges, the valleys, feeling the weight of the black triangle against my chest. They'll come again, I said. Stronger, better prepared. And next time, they won't just be after the rookies. They'll want us, Emberfall. All of us. Reyes nodded, fingers hovering over the encrypted drives. Then we give them exactly what they expect. A ghost, a trace, a shadow, and nothing more. Conrad's eyes met mine. We don't just survive. We teach. Again. I picked up the black triangle patch, worn and frayed, silver edges glinting in the low light. I pressed it into my palm. We are Emberfall, I said. And if they want ghosts, they'll meet us fully awake. Night fell, but for once it wasn't oppressive. It was strategic. Every shadow, every ridge, every gust of wind became our ally. And in the silence, we moved, 3 figures bound by history, experience, and the unspoken understanding that some missions never truly end. The world thought we had vanished, that Emberfall had been erased. But we were still here, watching, waiting, and ready. Because some ghosts don't fade. They fight. And some units never stop serving.